Hi, I'm William Spaniel. Let's learn about international relations. Today's topic is the democratic peace theory. So remember that in the past we have treated states as though they're all just identical unitary actors and they behave very similarly in what they're looking for and how they're going to obtain their objectives. And that was very useful. It got us a long way in terms of rationalist explanations for war and also in understanding why states want to trade with one another. But if we just limited our analysis to that, we would be missing out on a lot of important details. And so moving forward for the next couple of units, and then maybe also a little bit beyond that, we're going to be looking inside of the states and seeing how different facets of states can affect international outcomes. And as the title implies, today we're going to be talking about democracy and the democratic peace theory. I think the democratic peace theory is among the most well-known ideas in political science, both in terms of us who do this as a profession, the academics who are interested in studying political science and political outcomes, but also in terms of your average person just on the streets and in terms of politicians. So what is the democratic peace? Well, in a nutshell, it is that democracies tend not to fight democracies. That's what the democratic peace theory tells us, is that when you have two democracies together, they're not going to be fighting one another. And to see how this has proliferated into the understanding or into the political realm, I want to look at a couple of presidents here, the two presidents before Barack Obama. First, we're looking at Clinton here, and in the 1994 State of the Union address, he said that ultimately the best strategy to ensure our security and to build a durable peace is to support the advance of democracy elsewhere. Democracies don't attack each other. And George W. Bush took a similar line. This was very important when we were looking into the war in Iraq. This actually comes from a little bit after the start of the war in 2003, but in 2004, in a press conference, Bush said that democracies don't go to war with each other, and the reason why is that the people in most societies don't like war, and they understand what war means. And he's got great faith in democracies to promote peace, and that's why Bush was such a strong believer that the only way forward in the Middle East is to promote democracy. So this is something that politicians believe, and it also is an important determinant in policy outcomes. Again, reminding you back to the 2003 Iraq War. Among other things, there was the idea that the Iraqi government, Saddam Hussein, was trying to build weapons of mass destruction, and that would be bad for us. That was part of the reason why we invaded Iraq in 2003. But another reason that we invaded Iraq in 2003, one of the justifications for it, was that if we could establish a democracy in the Middle East, this would proliferate around the Middle East and in turn promote peace within the Middle East. So this is an important determinant in policy outcomes and something that we should at least understand and check and verify that, this is actually something important. There's actually something going on here, and it's not just, complete far-fetched nonsense. So, is this true? So, big question in this video is, are democratic countries more peaceful? And the answer is that it's kind of true, kind of not. So what do I mean by that? Well, take two democracies. Democracy plus democracy, that means that you're going to have very little war. You're not going to expect those two countries from fighting each other, just in terms of the historical statistical trend. Two democracies tend not to fight one another. In contrast, if you take a democracy and a non-democracy, you'll see some war. So war in general, despite the fact that the United States has been engaging in it relatively frequently as of late, is very infrequent on the whole. And so that's why I have some war, not a lot of war there. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at a democracy and a non-democracy, those two guys are more likely to fight each other than in this first case when you had a democracy and a democracy. The other thing that's interesting to note here, though, is that if we remove democracy from the equation entirely and we just look at two non-democracies, then they are also likely to fight some war. And what's really interesting here is that the some war here and the some war here, the way I'm defining just some war, I know it's nebulous, I'm not giving you exact statistics here, but that's sort of irrelevant to the theoretical point that I'm trying to make here, and that is that your expectation about a democracy fighting a non-democracy is the same as a non-democracy fighting another non-democracy. That is to say, democracies are only peaceful toward each other. They are not peaceful from a democracy to a non-democracy. So it's just like having two non-democracies and expectation of war when you have one democracy but not another democracy in the pair of countries that you're looking at. So this really only works when we're looking at democracies and democracies. It's only between two democracies that we actually expect very little war to happen. Now, I want to go over some caveats of this theory before we launch into topics related to this in the next few videos. So first, there's a big issue here of how we've defined democracy. Is Mexico today a democracy? Is Russia today a democracy? Was the United States in 1796 a democracy? Of course, in 1796, the United States only privileged white males with franchisement, and that's obviously not true today. So do we define a democracy the same way we would do in the United States in 1796 rather, as we would today? And that's questionable. And so a lot of the research has gone into, can we have different measurements of democracy and will we still get the same results? And more or less that's what we see, is that the results that we see are robust to changing our definitions of democracy. So really it's not that this result that democracies tend not to fight democracies is based off of how we define democracies. It's pretty robust to our definition of democracy. So that's not that much of a concern. Another concern, and this is, I think, a little bit more noteworthy, is that we have to come up with a definition of war, and the standard way we do this is there's this data set out there called the Correlates of War, and it looks at wars from 1816 to the present, and the way they define war is to look at conflicts that involve at least 1,000 battle deaths on both sides. So the reason that they have this 1,000 battle death minimum is to make sure that there's actually sustained fighting going on, and it's not a matter of just a quick little, I punched you, I killed a couple of guys, and then I left. That's not really war, it's just a militarized interstate dispute, and so we differentiate those two by drawing the line at 1,000 battle deaths. We ensure that there are at least 100 battle deaths per side, or 1,000 troops committed on both sides, to make sure that there's a balanced fight between these two parties, and it's not just one state bombing the other state and the other state not being able to do anything about it. So there's got to be some evenness to the conflict. It can't be, or it doesn't have to be extremely even, of course, because it could be the case that there's 100 battle deaths on one side and then 100,000 on the other side. That's still going to qualify as a conflict, but you need at least one side to be able to put some sort of damage on the other side in order for it to qualify as a war. And the last thing is that you need continuous conflict. So these battle deaths have to occur within a 12-month period. Otherwise, we could be looking at a period of 100 years where over the course of 100 years, you have non-sustained fighting that racks up these 1,000 battle deaths and at least 100 on each side, but that's really not a continuous conflict. That's over time. And so we have this continuous conflict rule to rule that out, actually. The important part of this is that this rules ancient Greece out. Ancient Greece had a lot of democracies. Again, not in the way that we might define democracies today, because enfranchisement was very limited. But when we have these requirements here, and we have this rule about only looking at the 1816 to the present, that rules out ancient Greece. Okay? All right. Now, the rule is not an ironclad law. So democracies sometimes do fight other democracies. It's not perfect. There are exceptions. So again, we've just looked at ancient Greece, the War of 1812, the Spanish-American War, Lebanon's involvement against Israel in the Six-Day War, and the Kargil War. These are all examples of when democracies have fought wars against other democracies. Now, for whatever reason, some of the people who like to talk about the democratic peace theory will wipe away these examples or these counterexamples and say, you know, they don't really matter. Ancient Greece, that was a long time ago, and that's not how we define democracy as we would today. In the War of 1812, the United States was a democracy, but the Great Britain didn't have power in the parliament, and it was all about the king and the House of Lords, so they weren't really democratic. We don't really have to count that. And the Kargil War between India and Pakistan are fledgling democracies, so they don't really count, and so forth. They'll come up with exceptions, or why these should be exceptions and shouldn't be counted toward the rule, and I don't really think that that's necessary to actually discuss, or actually even that important. It's just a matter of, the important matter is that the democracies not fighting democracies is a trend. It doesn't have to be an ironclad rule to be important. And so that's really what I'm trying to say is here, don't look at the exceptions and don't even bother trying to give us a reason why these don't really count. That's not as important as the fact that it's true that democracies tend not to fight other democracies. That's sufficient enough to be interesting and worthy of study. All right, the last caveat, and I think this is way more important than any of the other caveats, is that very few democracies existed before the end of World War II. And so when we're looking at these data sets, virtually all of the democracy versus democracy data that we have comes from the era of the Cold War. And that's important because just about all of the democracies were allied against communism at the time. And so if we're looking at the democratic peace and we're trying to make a causal inference about what's causing peace, i.e. democracies are causing peace, it's hard not to be able to rule out the fact that it could be the case that it's just democracies at the time during the Cold War were allied against communism. They had a mutual enemy, and so that allowed them to group together under peaceful conditions because they were so worried about communism, and that doesn't really say anything about the world without this mutual enemy in communism. So that's important, and it's noteworthy that we have a sort of an identification problem having all of this data clustered, or not all of this data, but most of this data clustered during the Cold War and very little before World War II when there were only about 10 democracies in the world, and only having 20 years in the post-Cold War era to have data that actually takes place outside of the Cold War. So that's concerning. But nevertheless, the result is interesting. And so in the next video, we're going to discuss a couple, or actually rather a lot of different theories of why the democratic peace exists. So that's what we're going to be looking at next time, is the theories behind the democratic peace. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you next time. Take care.